Hello, and welcome to the ALN 2020 Asset Leadership Forum, Restructuring America. I'm Nick Kinoki, the ALN Director of Technology, and I'm very excited to be starting off today's event, The Future of Assets. I would like to take a moment to thank our organizational members. Without them, none of this would be possible. And then one final note before we begin: if you're watching and you have any comments or questions, please write them in the chat or the Q&A feature of this Zoom webinar, and we will try to answer them or address them. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Zach, the ALN board member and Uberlytics CMO.
Hello, and on the behalf of the Asset Leadership Network board, our membership, and the event planning team, we are delighted to welcome you to the 2020 Fall Forum. We have some sadness in not being together in Washington, D.C., as we have been for the last 7 or 8 years. But we are very excited about how the online format is allowing us to extend participation literally around the world. And we have an incredible lineup of speakers. We have asset managers and participants joining us from all over the country and all over the world. And we're so excited to be able to extend that in this format. But while we're not together, there are still going to be all the things that you would come to expect from the Asset Leadership Fall Forum. There are some things that I've always appreciated during the event. One is the general diversity. We every year address an incredible range of sectors. We talk about a broad range of asset classes. We address multiple areas of practice under the asset management umbrella. And we have a really diverse representation of people and experience working in different roles, in different ways, who have so many rich contributions to give to this community. The other thing that I always appreciate about the Asset Leadership Network and our annual event is the ambitious and innovative thinking. This year, we have set the bold aim of rethinking the concept of value and applying asset management principles and practices to solving some of our most intractable challenges that we face today. That is bold, that is ambitious. Today, we're going to be talking about the National Asset Leadership Strategy, which is nothing if not bold and audacious, but we believe it is necessary and we believe it's entirely possible. And the innovators that are gathering to tackle this are impressive. And I believe we're going to see some really amazing things coming out of this event. While we are bold and aspirational, we are also practical. Every session over the next 3 weeks will yield insights and practical things that you can take and apply to your job and to your mandate in managing assets. You will learn things that will help you be a better asset leader. And we encourage you to attend as many sessions as possible, including the ones that are very far afield from your reference, your sector, your discipline. As we collaborate together and learn from each other, the practice of asset management, the application of ISO 55000, the benefits of asset leadership are going to raise us all up. So there is so much to learn, so much to discover, and so much to contribute. We encourage you to invite your colleagues to join us. It's possible to register throughout the weeks, so don't miss that opportunity. And thank you. So now I am pleased to introduce Jim Dieter, founder and executive director of the Asset Leadership Network. Jim is a good friend, a mentor, a collaborator, I'll say co-conspirator, as we tackle this challenge of raising the bar for asset leadership and advocating and championing the notion of bringing asset leadership to federal assets and across the country. So Jim, we turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for those great words. It really is exciting every year for this event. And I think in its own way, maybe even more exciting this year. Uh, just a lot of great ideas coming together. Several topics that I'm really, really interested in, including our initiating a discussion about equity and asset leadership, uh, areas where we can really make a difference. So I'm trying to, as as the leader of this group, but also with my participation in TC 251, one of the strengths I think I bring is trying to see complex things in a simpler way. So that's what I'm going to talk about, a few topics this morning that I think we might think we already know about, but perhaps there's a slightly simpler way to think about them and how they all come together. This probably looks very familiar to most of you that have dealt with ISO 55000. And these are words from ISO 55001 in the introductory sections. Requirements for establishment, implementation, maintenance, and improvement of a management system for asset management, referred to as an asset management system. I can't tell you how much time we spent talking about that simple concept, but nobody thought a asset management system was too much of too easy to trip up the tongue. And then from 55,000, the definition of an asset management system talks about elements of an organization and establishing asset management policy and asset management objectives. And of course, the processes needed to achieve those objectives. So several key factors brought to the forefront right away. Now, what it's not saying, what's not in ISO 55000, is that this is an asset system. So it's not about asset policy and asset objectives. So a subtle and important difference. Now, nobody's saying that overall it's not about assets. The standard is about asset management. So 55001 describes a management system for asset management. Doesn't describe a management system for assets, not about managing assets. It is about asset management. And you see how I've cleverly put a big number up here to help you recognize the places, the points I'm trying to make today. So that's the first one, and probably a lot of you are tuned into that. Jack Dempsey, who's a key player in TC 251 and ALN Senior Fellow, has written an excellent paper on the difference between managing assets and asset management. And that is available on the TC 251 website. You can find it just by Googling that. But that does bring it to asset management then. So love, talked about simple definition. Coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from assets. Very simple and really, really groundbreaking definition, because it's about the organization and the value from the assets. That's a big deal. Now, two key factors in that short definition are about activities and about value. Let's talk about each of those for a few minutes. So a definition that's not in either of those documents is a definition of asset management activities. So I would define that as the activities of an organization to realize value from assets. Now, asset management activities is mentioned as a concept multiple times, but not in a featured way in the documents. But in actually implementing ISO 55000, it's really important. So what does that look like? So I got a zebra chart here with a multicolored zebra. And you see that I've listed a lot of different asset management activities. I don't think too many of them that we can argue, aren't about assets and asset management. But if you're looking there and saying, well, I don't see mine, or I don't see ones I'm thinking of, we could probably have 1,000, pieces of pie in this chart. There are a lot of different asset management activities. Just a core concept. But somehow we didn't get it into 55,001. I'm personally going to see what we can do about that. Now you see also some of those, I'm not going to get into that today, but some of these are directly about assets like maintenance and operation. And some are about asset information, BIM, reliability, inventory, audit, are really more about asset information. I've talked about in past talks in our fall event, talked about my 3-circle chart about strategy, tactics, and operations. So we're firmly in the tactics and operations area here. So here's an example from, it's based on an actual implementation that I was involved in. And the people in the room, when we started working on this, were these pieces of the pie, were these asset management activities and how they fit together. Notably, the IT asset management people decided they didn't want to play. And all of the IT assets were no longer a part of the ISO 55001 implementation at that organization. That's a significant change in the scope. So scope is very much related to this. The portfolio of assets is very much related to it. When we talk about NALs in a few minutes, a key part of NALs, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, is an asset taxonomy that talks about that portfolio of assets. But here we're talking about the asset management, the asset management activities that are involved in dealing directly with the assets. So we talked about the activities. Let's talk about value. Now that can be a tough discussion, but back to simple, the definition of asset that you see there, and I think probably all are familiar with, is again on that value to an organization. And this really is an earth-shattering definition change. From a finance perspective, has kind of owned this definition in the past. And the definition of capital asset has become the definition of asset. And it's really the value of assets, and more from a compliance and depreciation perspective. And I lived in a compliance world for the first many years of my life in asset management. And in a compliance world, you only spend the money you need to spend. It's not about return on investment. It's about how little can we spend to be compliant in anywhere that I ever worked. But now we're talking about the value to an organization and how we in asset leadership, asset management, can be involved in realizing that value to the organization. But our challenge has been, how to reveal that value. How to reveal that value. So the TC 251 has already made a couple attempts to talk about value. And they showed how complex it was because we couldn't get any kind of consensus around the topic. But I'm going to put myself on a limb today with a couple statements here. And the first is that we talk about value. To me, the first things you think about is how is the value expressed? And then the second thing is how is the value measured? How is it expressed and how is it measured? And I'm not going to get into measurement today. That would take, much more time. So value is an expression of the achievement of the organizational objectives that we've been talking about. So in a for-profit organization, the objective is money, or better, triple bottom line, people, profit, and planet. Or there's newer, better approaches to that as well. Your own organization could have its own approach to it. But the bottom line is it's largely financially organized and expressed. Now, in a not-for-profit, which really is in government, which is really the subject of another TC 251 effort, which is a draft of a document called ISO 55011. It was the goal is to talk about asset management in governments and what's different about that. And I think a big one is what I'm saying right on this slide. In not-for-profits and governments, the objective is policy and programs. You might be able to express those in financial terms, but distributing checks to Social Security recipients is a policy and program, and the assets that support that program, their objective is to get those checks delivered. We could go on and lots of different examples. It's an interesting topic, but objective, policy, and programs. All right, so let's circle back to asset management now and focus on the first couple words of this, which says it's a coordinated activity. I wrote a whole white paper, I drafted a white paper saying that the word coordinated shouldn't be in that definition. And I could still make that argument, but I think it's easier to think about what are those coordinated activities of an organization, all right? We talked about that. So we also, in 55,000, didn't talk about who was doing the coordinating. Leadership is mentioned in ISO 55,000 in terms of, here's what we need from leadership to get asset management done, to accomplish those asset management activities. But it doesn't address who should be running this in an organization. Should it be everybody? Should it be some of the people? Should it be a separate office? Should it be a team? We didn't go there. We wasn't there. But we see that's where asset leadership fits in, and is in fact the definition of asset leadership, is planning and directing the activity of an organization to realize value from assets. So it's making it happen in the organization, and especially in achieving the mission and objectives of the organization. So let's think about that, the mission and objectives of the organization. So asset leadership connects the organizational objectives to the asset management objectives. When those of us who have had the chance to work on strategic asset management plans, or SAMPs, know that this connection becomes really important. It's what's working on real world cases. It's what brought this to the forefront in my thinking, is you have the asset management objectives, and now we're trying to say, well, what are the organizational objectives? And then how do I tie the asset management objectives to those organizational objectives? In the NOWS effort, again, which we'll follow in a couple of minutes here, one of our initial problems when we started working on it last year was, what are the national objectives? Wow, You don't see those listed anywhere. Agencies has objectives, but national objectives are often buried deep within policy and bills that are passed, and are difficult to put in one place. And of course, some of those, as we're well aware in a political season, are things that can change from administration to administration. Others, perhaps not, perhaps need to be more stable. Sustainability is a simple one to think of as a national objective. And it's easy to see how a national objective of sustainability could be tied to an asset management objectives and how to accomplish that nationally and then in the various sectors of an organization. So that's my last big point I wanted to talk about. Hopefully those simple concepts resonate with you and perhaps give you an opportunity to talk to others about them, or to have them in mind for both for the presenters and for the participants in the activities over the next 3 weeks, to think about how those resonate, across what we're trying to do here. And I always say from an asset leadership perspective, we're really looking for win-wins on how we can help organizations be successful using asset management and the asset management system that's laid out in ISO 55000. That's a really, really strong document, and work has begun on even improving it over the next few years. So it's a great opportunity, and it's a great opportunity for us as we are involved in an organization and in a profession that's really on the upswing and is more and more being a topic of conversation and a force that can contribute that value to organizations. So just a couple takeaways on the significance. That asset leadership connects asset management to larger organizational and to the organization mission and objectives. And that asset related decisions can be made based on organizational mission and objectives. Steve Whitten from the city of Calgary, it's a great story that we've told in the past, but I'll share it again, is when they started out going on their asset management journey, they had organizations coming to them and saying, I need money for bridges, I need money for tunnels, I need money for pedestrian overpasses, I need money for trains. And they had to make those decisions independently. When they consolidated their asset-related budget in an asset management department, they were able to move to the decision point to being, we need to move people. How do we want to do it? And where do we want to invest our resources? As we think about the nation's infrastructure and other assets, importantly, not just infrastructure, going forward, I think that's the opportunity that presents itself, is to make decisions on where we're trying to go and what we're trying to do, and think about the value not of assets, but the value from assets and the value that these assets provide to the constituencies of the government and to organizations. So that is my part of the presentation today. Thank you very much for listening. It's now my pleasure to introduce a group of the folks that have been working on the development of the National Asset Leadership Strategy and Sector Asset Leadership Success Strategy. So we have Moshe Nelson from Grant Thornton, Jack Kelly from the Asset Leadership Network, Jonathan Schneider from Grant Thornton, Ed Sadfi Safety, although Ed's has his name as Jonathan Snyder, weirdly, but he can change his name when he gets here. And Spence Boyer, also from Grant Thornton. And they will share with you some information about the National Asset Leadership Strategy. Welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you for those opening remarks. I'm Moshe Nelson. I'm a principal with Grant Thornton. I oversee our asset management solution within the public sector, and I'm really excited to speak about the NALS 2020. I think now more than ever, we need to think nationally about how we manage our assets and critical infrastructure. We're in unprecedented times where environmental, economic, and health issues have made a significant and immediate impact on the nation. Over the past 2 years, our nation's infrastructure and people have been tested in a myriad of ways, from environmental factors such as hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding, security threats such as cyber and terrorism, economics, shifting workforces and global supply chain, and of course, healthcare with global pandemic illuminating factors in our abilities to coordinate and respond. And lastly, social unrest and division as inequalities are heightened by the crisis. If one aspect that is positive coming out of COVID-19 is the fact that federal, state, local, and private sector entities have come together and worked collectively to advance national and global ideals. It's not perfect, but this crisis has forced us to work a little bit more effectively. Asset management, in our view, for those that are attending this, is the linchpin for navigating these changes. We're enabling critical care to be given to the sick, movement of goods and supply chains to ensure critical services can be delivered, from guarding our country to taking care of the elderly and sick population. And then we're driving innovative responses to rapidly and evolving challenges, such as the hunt for the COVID-19 vaccine and ultimately for distribution. The NOW strategy began 2 years ago, where we started the conversation for a system-wide national asset management approach. And many of the issues that we've seen today with COVID-19 have illustrated the importance that ISO 55000 and its concepts are and exist to manage day-to-day coordination and plan for the future. Some examples of that are strategic asset management planning, data management, risk, culture, and communications. Wall Street Journal and Council of Foreign Relations have recently pushed out articles that have described how coordination and data management in systems throughout the COVID-19 pandemic have achieved many different challenges that, quite frankly, implementing ISO 55000 may provide a framework to address. So by utilizing this approach, federal, state, and local, and the private sector can begin to work more collectively and advance day-to-day management principles as well as future strategic planning efforts. I'm going to turn it now to Jack Kelly to continue with our discussion on the NOWs. Jack?
Thanks, Moshe. So I first learned about, I'm going to give you a little bit of history first. I first learned about the ALN and ISO 55000 in a meeting at GSA with Jim Dieter and Jack Dempsey to discuss a draft executive order that would have required federal agencies to adopt ISO 55000. This was back in 2015, and some of y'all may remember that back then men were expected to wear pants that matched their jackets. The executive order didn't go anywhere at the time, but Jim maintained, and I later developed an interest in finding a way to engage senior federal policymakers, either in the White House or in Congress, to require the adoption of the standard. And let me just say quickly, adopting the standard is what we in the ALN think is the best way to advance asset management, particularly among organizations that are starting out from a fairly low level of awareness of it. So that's, when I say ISO 55000, it's kind of a synonym for asset management. In 2018, as Moshe mentioned, at our Fall Leadership Week event, we presented a very early proposal for developing a national asset leadership strategy as a way to engage the appropriate parties in all sectors to develop a national approach for addressing our nation's infrastructure and other asset deficiencies. We invited interested parties to join in with us in developing that strategy. And I'm very pleased to note that Grant Thornton stepped up to partner with us in that work and has continued to do so. Beginning after the conference, beginning the next year in early 2019, we sat down with Grant Thornton and had a series of meetings to define the elements of this national asset leadership strategy. We wanted to use as much as we could the same elements that were part of ISO 55000. And the result of that work was published in a very nice brochure in August of 2019, and we called it the National Asset Leadership Strategy, Part 1, the Foundation. A presentation on that document was presented at the 2019 Asset Leadership Week in October 2019. Now, again, mostly following ISO 55000, the NALS Foundation consisted of 6 elements that will sound very familiar to you. First, national objectives. Jim talked about those when he gave his talk. And we came up with some sort of model national objectives based on the kinds of things that are in laws and regulations, things like clean air, clean water, public safety, things like that. The one part of the NALS elements, or the one NALS element that was not included in ISO 55000 was taxonomy, which Jim also mentioned. And the reason for that is that ISO 55000 is written to organizations, and it assumes that each organization has its own asset taxonomy. However, when you're approaching all organizations in the nation, you have to establish a common taxonomy just so that you can communicate across those different other organizations. Stakeholders, very important. And stakeholders, we did a lot of work on that, and we have some detailed descriptions of the different kinds of stakeholders, both internal and external. Scope. What's the scope of the nation's assets? Well, basically, it's pretty much everything. Asset management objectives. When you think about, those are objectives for the assets themselves. The condition of the assets, how much it costs to operate the assets, and so forth. And then finally, and this was really important, was effective asset management systems. Effective asset management systems are the expected outcome of implementing ISO 55000. Now, other people may have other ways to have effective asset management systems, but as I mentioned earlier, we think that ISO 55000 is the most reliable path forward for organizations that are just getting started. So after the 2019 event, copies of the NALS Part 1 document were distributed to each member of the House Oversight and Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and also the House Oversight and Reform Committee. We also distributed copies to various Senate offices. Earlier this year, we began working on how to implement this foundational document and decided that the best way to proceed was according to different sectors. For example, transportation, water, wastewater, healthcare, energy, and so forth. The reason that we decided to do that is because when you think about approaching Congress, that's how you have to approach Congress, according to committees and subcommittees. And each of these groups, particularly at the subcommittee level, specialize in a particular sector. And so there's not like one congressional body that can pass a law that covers everything. You have to deal with the different sectors. So in addition to that, the players are different, the associations are different, their academic programs are different. There are a lot of differences that are sector unique. And so that formed the basis of how we're proceeding. So we met virtually over the course of several months and developed what we now call the National Asset Leadership Success Strategy. We put success in there because asset management is intended to help organizations achieve their objectives. And we want them to achieve their objectives successfully. So that's how success got into the label. Now, Spence Moyer from Grant Thornton is going to give you an overview of a document that we developed to carry out that sector-based strategy. Spence?
Thanks, Jack. Hi, everyone. My name is Spence Boyer, and I'm an associate within Grant Thornton's Asset Management Solutions team. So I'll be talking about the development of sector strategic asset management plans through the use of the document Jack just touched on. We've been creating, known as the Sector Asset Leadership Success Strategy, also known as SALS. So the goal of SALS is to help guide sector experts in the creation of a framework and decision tool based upon agreed asset management objectives for each sector. Sectors we will be discussing during this event range from healthcare and pharma asset management to federal facilities and water asset management, though there are clearly more sectors to be addressed by the SALS. So the SALS provides 22 key questions for each sector, the answer to which will help formulate a sector strategic asset management plan. These questions cover defining the sector objectives, its current state, boundaries within the sector, the scope of asset support, taxonomy and stakeholders, the desired end state, obstacles and compliance, as well as benefits from effective asset management systems. These questions will help guide sector leaders and experts to understand the current state of their sector asset management and to determine the desired end state for each sector's strategic asset management plan. So the SALS will also help each sector's strategic asset management plan adopt the asset management concepts from ISO 55000, which will provide a dynamic leadership guidance and decision tools. So to conclude, the Sector Asset Leadership Success Strategy, the SALS, is a document to help guide sector experts in creating an asset management framework and decision support tool to effectively utilize current and future assets, as well as to adopt the asset management concept from ISO 55000. This document is a key tool to move each sector from a current asset management state to a state of higher asset management utilization. To meet these goals, sector experts need to work together to tackle these questions and lead each sector towards a better asset management plan. I'm now going to pass it over to John, who will be giving an overview of the National Asset Leadership Success Strategy, also known as the NALS. John, go ahead.
Thank you, Spence. So hi, everyone. My name is John Schneider. I'm manager within Grant Thornton's Asset Management Solution team with Motion Nelson, as you just mentioned earlier, and Spence. I've been working in the asset management world for about 5 years now, so I thank you all for letting me be part of this panel today. I'm going to wrap up the panel with a quick overview of the NALS, or what we call the National Asset Leadership Success Strategy that you've heard mentioned a few times so far in this panel. So this document really builds on what Jack discussed earlier, which was the first iteration of the NALS document. That iteration really provided elements for policymakers to consider in the adoption of a national strategy for asset management. It set a baseline for everything we're talking about today, gave us the tools we needed to develop sector plans that Spence just spoke about a few minutes ago. So about after a year after developing the NALS, we thought it was time to revisit, as Jack mentioned. And so we developed the NALS, National Asset Leadership Success Strategy, which is the organizing framework using proven structures and focusing on enduring principles to vastly improve the asset management in the US with the hope of really persuading political authorities to gain their support. So it will emphasize success in achieving national objectives, provides more definitive policy guidance than we've done in the past, and really does try to cover the incredible breadth of assets that are out there. So natural resources, real estate, personal property, IT assets, space, and military assets. To kind of state it more simply, the purpose of this document is to improve the allocation of both new and existing resources to achieve national goals, and really use those standards as a proven baseline to do this. We believe that the proven structures in place and the enduring principles will vastly improve asset management in the US and promote political awareness and hopefully encourage a positive impact and support. And so when we started doing this, we spent a lot of time thinking about what we wanted to accomplish through NALS, and it's a large undertaking as I spoke about earlier. We're looking at policy and management of assets across all the levels of government. So I'd like to just provide you a quick overview of what those objectives were and what we finally landed on. And these are the items we really feel are essential to the document. So first, we acknowledge in the problem with transparency and accountability. We then maximize value of existing resources. We define a method for prioritizing future investment. Fourth, which I think Jim had mentioned earlier, is ensuring equitable allocation of resources and financial accountability. And the last one to kind of tie it all together is developing a national approach to national problems and addressing those policy concerns with a policy solution. So I think you'll see these objectives be kind of a theme throughout the next future panels throughout the next couple of weeks. So while the first iteration of the document we spoke about before provided detailed guidance to the reader, we wanted to infuse this version with a little more call to action. So as Moshe spoke about earlier a few minutes ago, the need for a management system approach to asset management has really never been higher. The aging infrastructure is hurting the country across all the different industries. And yeah, they're really not siloed to a specific industry. So we really think it's key that there is a systemic approach to infrastructure and assets, especially now in a time with a lot of budgetary unknowns. We know it's essential that all levels of government, federal, state, local, and the private sector, to really get the highest value possible out of their assets. And so while the sector plans that Spence spoke about earlier will really provide those granular details that get us from point A from point B, how do we improve the adoption of ISO 55000? The National Asset Leadership Success Strategy will provide that higher level discussion on the importance of a systemic approach and a management system approach, a government-wide approach to asset management, and really why we do need this now and why it's urgent to move forward on this. So we hope to deliver this to the upcoming Congress and administration later this year. So I think that wraps up my segment of the panel. I think we do have some time for questions if there are any.
Since we have a couple of minutes, let me elaborate on the stakeholder element that I talked about briefly. We've divided stakeholders into two large categories. The first category, the asset owners and operators. Those are the people that actually have the assets, and we want them to implement good asset management. The other group of stakeholders consist of people that we call influencers. And influencers can be Congress, it can be government decision makers, it could be the media, it could be associations. There are a whole lot of people whose activities and decisions can influence how organizations actually manage their assets. So as we proceed down this path of developing a strategy, we're trying to be very sensitive to who the key players are in each sector. And then we're trying to figure out the best way to approach those players, with the idea that we want them to help pull together and come up with a strategy, basically a sector-based strategic asset management plan that will help everybody in that sector effectively implement asset management. Now, one of the things that doesn't do yet, but it's something that we have on our long-term list, is that doesn't really help address the issue of how you figure out how to basically take the nation's assets and place them in the most promising places. Because again, we're kind of stovepiped in the way that we're organized in Congress to make those decisions. But one of the things that we hope to be able to come up with eventually is to get to the place that Australia is already at, which is they have a national infrastructure plan. And if we could ever get to that point, then that would be a happy day for all of us, I think. If there are no other questions, it just so happens that I see two of my panelists on the next panel available. And so we might just go ahead and switch into that panel, which is a panel to discuss the future of assets. Jenny didn't mention this, that not only is she on the planning committee for this event, but so are Jim Dieter and Mike Bordenaro and myself. And as we were thinking about how to set this whole first day up, we decided, first of all, that the future of assets would be a wonderful topic with which to kick off the whole event. And we knew that we wanted Jim to give the opening keynote because it was important that we set the tone for the whole event with the comments that we knew he was going to make. And then we wanted to have this panel on the National Asset Leadership Strategy, because that's been kind of the core of the Asset Leadership Network's work in conjunction with Grant Thornton for 2 years now. So, and that, as I think we've said before, that we think is our path forward to actually get all the right people engaged in improving asset management in the United States.
Hey, Jack, if you have a moment, we've got a few questions.
Excellent. Okay, super.
One question would be, spoken of the problems of transparency and accountability. Can you speak to the question of coordinated management? I think that was from Cecilia Mawat. Yeah, you raised the issue of problem of transparency and accountability. Jim spoke to the question of coordinated management. Maybe I'll get her to clarify on that question, unless you get that. We've got another question. When you speak about sectors in municipal services, a specific sector under consideration, question mark?
Well, so one of the sectors that's very important at the municipal level is water and wastewater, and one of the sessions that we have later in this event is focused on that. In fact, if you think about the schedule for the 9 days of our event, many of the days focus on a specific sector. So that's a way to kind of have a conversation around a sector that we hope will help advance the National Asset Leadership Strategy for that sector.
Great. And then someone asked, is there one branch of or department of the government that is close to adopting ISO 55000?
Interestingly, yes. The one that I think is the furthest along is the Western Area Power Administration. Now they're not seeking certification, but their CEO came and spoke to us about 3 years ago, I think now, a gentleman named Mark Gabriel. And he came in appreciating the value of asset management from the get-go. So this was an unusual situation where you had top agency leadership coming in and embracing the standard, and not the normal situation where people who understand it at the staff level have to go convince the people at the top that it's worthwhile. So basically, Western Area Power Administration has implemented ISO 55000, and when they first did it, one of the things that you have to do when you implement asset management is a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with assets. It's a lot of things having to do with organization, the kind of data that you have, whether you assess risk appropriately, whether you measure success, and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are just basic good management that organizations have to do. What Mark did was they set out to do that, and they focused on the scope of their asset management system just on transformers, because transformers are a critical part of their electric distribution system. After about 2 years, they came back and talked to us and said they had expanded the scope of their asset management system to include 2 other assets, breakers and just distribution lines. And their intention is to take the scope to cover all of their assets over time. So that's the agency that I know that's the furthest along. I think we're going to hear later this week from the Department of Homeland Security, who is going to talk about where they are in asset management. And I think they've made, as I understand it, they made a lot of progress. I haven't heard the talk yet.
And if, I can take a crack at the previous question regarding accountability. So I think one of the most important aspects of ISO 55000 is data and performance management, right? So what we're seeing as a trend holistically across the industry is that there is greater accountability due to the knowledge and existence of data that's available required for asset management. There is very few industries out there that individuals cannot essentially generate what a standard taxonomy should be from an asset management perspective, whether that's facilities or infrastructure or technology itself. So the question regarding, will the NALs and ISO 55000 support greater accountability? Inherently, it does. And having performance metrics that were specifically identified within 55000 gives a governance and communications capability that will inherently support greater accountability for the assets. I think there was also a great question regarding alignment to what CISA has come up with sector plans, and CISA has done a significant amount of work, particularly in risk management, another core area of ISO 55000. And I can already see the dialogue happening in the chat, which is fantastic that we're doing this real time and being able to align some of the efforts between the NALS sector-specific plans and what has gone on inherently with certain governmental institutions. So this is very exciting.
And Moshe, I'd like to add a little bit more to that for Cecilia. You mentioned coordinated management, Cecilia, and Moshe mentioned the word governance. Overarching governance across all the functions of the life cycle of an asset, whatever it may be, is a requirement to define roles, responsibilities, and commensurate authority for each of the functions. And therein lies more accountability.
Great. We had one other question that was just, how could there possibly be a single strategy for an organization or, for anything as big as the United States with untold amounts of assets? How could there be a single unifying theory?
That's why we're taking the sector approach to begin with, because we don't know of how you can approach it comprehensively yet. We think that approaching it sector by sector offers the greatest promise of being able to make progress in these different areas.
And I also, Jack, I know we talked about this at length. Just the ability to apply the framework from a national perspective is a directional, piece of input that would enable more effective management across particular topic areas. So it's recognized, right? There cannot be one strategy to rule them all, but the framework does exist that can be applied nationally and then segmented out by sectors, which is what we're all trying for.
Well, these are great questions. I think we're going to have to run to the next topic because we have two gentlemen who are on here, and then we should have time for questions at the end if we didn't catch everything here. So I'd like to welcome Tom Smith and Tony McGrail to the conversation. I see there's Tony and there's Tom. So how this particular panel came about was Jim decided that after we had the NALS conversation, that he would like to hear from three people that he thought would have the most interesting things to say about asset management. And the three were Tom Smith, who's a retired professor of engineering and a longtime contributor to asset management thinking, Tony McGrail, who's a former colleague of Jim's, whose opinions Jim values very highly, and much to my surprise, me. So I'm telling you this up front so you know who to hold responsible if this doesn't go well. It's all Jim's fault. So of the three of us, I'm clearly the relative newbie to asset management. I joined the ALN back in 2015, and I've been really consumed with trying to learn as much about asset management as I can. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very committed to the ALN's goal of promoting the adoption of asset management in the United States. A lot of times people make a big deal about certification to the standard, and the ALN isn't really, we're kind of agnostic about certification, but we're very enthusiastic about adoption. And if you get certified, that's probably the best proof of adoption that you can come up with. But now I'd like to hear from my colleagues who have much more experience with asset management than I do. And I'm going to begin with Tom and then turn to Tony. My initial question, gentlemen, is based on your experiences, what are the factors that will likely impede or promote the adoption of asset management in the United States? Tom?
Okay, so let me just talk for a few minutes while we're looking for the slide. But I think I would just going to reinforce some points. I've been involved with asset management for probably 12, 15 years now. Involved with a standards committee for about 10 years. And I'm not going to talk a lot about ISO 55000. I think I understand it fairly well. And I would say one thing about it for all of you who are very much invested in the standard is it is a management system standard. ISO has about 45 management system standards. And I just got off a meeting of the American ANSI National Accreditation Board, which accredits the certifying bodies for all of the management system standards, as well as other technical standards. And it's pretty clear to me that the ISO 55000 to be successful needs to work in conjunction with other management system standards. We've talked about safety, we talked about security, somebody mentioned risk. There are standards for all those. We know about 9,000 and 14,000, which are leading standards. I think we're going to see 55,000 be successful when it is adopted and used in conjunction with other management system standards. And I'm not going to say a lot more about that, but these standards are all written to the same general template. They are meant to work together and they are meant to be shared. So I think that part of my emphasis, and actually a large part of it these days, is on looking at how management systems work together, the standards work together, and how the management system standards work with the inherent corporate management systems that we always encounter. So, enough of that. Future of asset management. One of the things I like to say is and to point out is that assets, physical assets, have become the leading edge of the organization in respect to many issues. And you don't have to look far to see assets, physical assets exposed to climate change. You can look to the West Coast, you can look to the South Coast, you can look to the Midwest, you can look to the East Coast. You can see where wildfires, where hurricanes, where drought have exposed physical assets to incredible difficulties. And that's impossible to ignore. To me, there's no question that asset management is critical, and to me, there's no question that it will be adopted. How it's adopted, I'm not sure, but you cannot ignore what's happening to assets these days. Whether you're an insurance company, whether you're a financier, whether you're a customer, whether you're a manager, you cannot ignore what's happening to physical assets. COVID has certainly exposed physical assets. We have airplanes sitting on the ground, and we have a cruise company spending $250 million a month to mothball cruise ships. I mean, that's asset management, but it was not exactly what we were looking for when we started talking about asset management. But this is an incredibly expensive time for physical assets. We have issues of capacity. Manufacturing is looking at rapid changes to its assets to meet capacity and to meet competition issues. And those changes will involve heavy automation and will change the nature, not only of the assets, but of the management of those assets. I expect to see much more automation of asset management. I've made a joke a number of times about rewriting ISO 55000 in machine language so that the robots can interpret it and enforce it. And I'm not so sure that's a joke anymore. And the last thing I'd say in terms of the value of assets is public poverty. The government agencies at the state and local level that you have mentioned and talked about are poor. they're facing the difficulties of managing assets with declining revenues in the case of fee-based revenues for assets. And most of our utilities are supported on fees, on user fees. And one, the users have trouble paying the fees. And two, when usage goes down, such as might be true with oil or water or other things, the usage fees can't keep up. So that means that the organization needs to put in a base increase. And you don't have to look far around the country to see political opposition to base rate increases. And yet you don't have to look far to see the need for those increases in terms of the aging infrastructure. So assets are in our sites, and they will remain there. And the leaders of these organizations are involved. They can't avoid being involved, I believe. I see them responding aggressively in some cases. In the industrial sector, particularly process industry, you don't have to look very far to see Industry 4.0 and the factory of the future being aggressively implemented right now. And you're seeing some of that in industries like construction, where we thought it would take longer, but it's moving in fairly quickly. I also see these responses completely hamstrung by politics in many cases, and politics in the broadest sense. That is, leaders at any level not wanting to take responsibility for the costs and consequences of these assets. So the strategy is business as usual in many cases and hope for the best. And I think my last sentence says, head in the sand is an attractive option, but it isn't going to help the problem. So those are my comments on asset management and assets.
Thanks, Tom. Tony, what are your thoughts?
Okay, in answer to the question about what does impede and what would promote the adoption of asset management, and asset management with a capital A and a capital M, then I would make a note that the assets with a capital A are not going away anytime soon. And the main things I've seen which impede the adoption of asset management approaches would be inertia and the fact that it costs money to change what people are doing. So there's a cost involved in doing something different. And it comes back to the question of show me the money. Why would I put money into this? You have to show me there's a benefit. The main thing that would promote the involvement of organizations into asset management, capital A and capital M, would seeing other people benefit from adopting asset management. So it's a chicken and egg to a degree. And they have to see the value of an investment to make a change. And that cost then has to be borne. So when Tom talks a little bit about rates and the rate base, there's a question of how we then adjust to make sure that we can invest in an aging infrastructure at the same time as investing in an aging asset management system. So to me, we need to have an understanding that it's the people who are going to make the changes. The assets aren't going away, and it's the context in which we operate which is going to force us to move forward. That's it.
Thanks, Tony. I want to follow up on one of the comments Tom made, because I think it's an extraordinarily powerful perspective, and that is that you have wide adoption of a lot of management system standards around the world. And what you realize is that, I mean, he touched on this, is a fair portion of the language in each of these management systems, mostly the language that talks about organization and data and risk and review, things like that, is common. I mean, it's in the world of ISO standards, they call it the blue text. And that blue text is common across all the management system standards. So if we could find somebody, an asset intensive organization that's already been certified, for example, to ISO 9001, then it would be very little additional work for them to gain ISO 55001 certification, should they choose to. So just to reinforce the point Tom made, and that is that for asset management purposes, we ought to try to build on the management system standard foundation that's already out there. And we're talking in terms of reported organizations that are certified to those standards, I think 9,001, it's like over 1 million. Or at least, no, it's 9,001 and 14,001. Together, it's about 1.3 million organizations certified to those standards around the world, which is enormous. So I would suggest that. The other thing, and I want to reinforce the point about politics and the ability to make good infrastructure, or I should say, the impact of politics of preventing the making of good decisions on infrastructure investments. In order, when this country was doing its best in terms of building like the interstate system and other big national projects, we had a political consensus about what was needed in the country. We needed electricity, we needed, good water, we needed a good, effective transportation network. And so you could get people from both sides of the aisle coming together and saying, okay, we might differ in some of the specifics, but we agree with the goal. We need to do something as a nation to solve this problem. We seem not to be at that stage anymore. I mean, one of the jokes in Washington, D.C. is how often there's been an infrastructure week. I mean, infrastructure week is announced, time passes, nothing happens. Nothing's even actually discussed about it. So that's one point. The other point is that when we talk, most of the conversation about infrastructure investments in this country is how much money can we find for new infrastructure. The beauty of ISO 55000 and other, good asset management techniques is that you make better decisions about the money that you're currently spending, and we're spending a bunch. So just the ability to get more benefit, get more value from the money we're already spending ought to be front and center in people's minds as they think about asset management in their organizations.
Yeah, I would say that the last point is one that deserves some real attention. At the municipal level, whether it's state or local, I have a whole file folder full of articles from newspapers and other blogs and so forth about utility managers, whether they're transit managers or water managers or whatever, coming out asking for rate increases and essentially being abandoned by the local politicians. The mayor or the city council will trot the manager out and then leave that poor manager hanging to dry because they won't take a stand on the need to spend money for assets. They're going to hide in the weeds and criticize additional spending and saying they're not for any more taxes, they're not for any more expenditure, but with no real proposal as to how we're going to manage to keep this infrastructure intact without it. I just look at the denial around lead water pipes, which seems to me a pretty straightforward issue. They're not a good idea, but actually getting the money to fix them, we're putting our heads in the sand, and that would be one of the clearest issues to me. I mean, there's no excuse for that one. So the other part of it is when you talk about managing infrastructure, there are a number of things that we call non-asset solutions. So there are some water utilities in drought-stricken areas in the US and all around the world that are spending up to 1/3 of their budget on water conservation. And the public relations, the management, all of the infrastructure, that's an organizational infrastructure that goes into water conservation, but it's real and it's as effective as putting in another pipe in many cases. So we need to think that there are non-asset solutions in many cases, which are solutions, and they are in many cases as troublesome and as expensive as asset solutions, but they're an alternative and they need to be put in there.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we need to discuss in the promotion in the future of asset management is not just a common taxonomy, which you mentioned before, Jack, but a common language to describe the assets and what they do. My own industry that I work in is the electric power industry. So when you mention WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, it's an area I've visited, it's an area I've worked with and gone out and tested power transformers for them. So if I mention the word power transformers, people will think, well, I've got power coming out the wall. I've got a transformer between the wall and my PC. It's a little box about yay big. I've got a power transformer. No, you haven't. A power transformer is well defined in the industry. It's defined by the Institution of Electrical and Electronic Engineers in the US and by the International Electrical Commission around the world. And it does provide a common language. And we have to start seeing the industry that we are in as having a means to talk to each other in a common format. So when someone mentions water pipes, we know exactly what they mean and what they're talking about. Is it the same water pipe serving a building as it serves coming out of the Hoover Dam, for example? There is a use of language, there is a use of taxonomy, which needs to be addressed and formalized so that we can then all talk about things in exactly the same way. It is very difficult. In my own industry, there's a thing called a common information model, allows utilities to share information. It's not complete. It doesn't include, or it did not include until recently, condition monitoring information. It had temperatures, but it wasn't considered to be a condition value. So as we look to the future, we need to understand that we have to move away from the Tower of Babel. What we need is a common Esperanto type language, which everyone can understand and has common meaning, and then we can understand common value.
Great point, Tony.
The oil and gas industry, there is an ISO standard taxonomy defined to oil and gas. And the reason that was developed was that for the very largest pieces of equipment in oil and gas, the undersea compressors and so forth, there aren't enough ends in any one company to do the required analytics. So in order to do what they need to do to manage that equipment, they need to share data. And the first step in sharing data was to develop a common taxonomy.
And you have to be careful, Tom, because when companies share data, they're also then exposing their weaknesses, because what you're interested in is repair cycles and failure modes. And if things are failing, that indicates that your company may not be doing as well as it should. And so the company I work for, Doble, we have clients of every major utility in North America, and a significant number will share their failure mode data, their power transformers, their breakers, their cables, etc. And what we find is that there are very, very different failure rates for very, very similar assets because of the operational capabilities of the organization. People don't necessarily want that to be public, so they have a reticence about sharing data.
Sure.
Do any of the industry associations offer opportunities or have any kind of membership requirements dealing with data sharing or common taxonomies?
So
Quite a number do.
Please go ahead.
No?
I would say not enough. And I would say that, as Tony just mentioned, there is not enough of that, and the data models are not rigorous enough. We're getting there, but as soon as you get into this, you realize the devil's in the details, and you better iron out those details. And they take a lot of commitment to get real data and that's truly shared.
Well, going back to the taxonomy, we developed within NALS Part 1, we developed a taxonomy at a very high level. And Jim Dieter has actually written an ASTM standard that I think is somewhere in the internal review process, which would formalize that taxonomy. So there's certainly an interest in trying to do that. And I hope that, that we'll be able to get that through.
The important thing is to share information about, coming back to the aging infrastructure, what actually matters in terms of what is aging. What do we need to keep track of? What do we need to look at? What data is going to tell us how things are performing? So that condition analysis is not a simple process. It's not necessarily linear, it's not uniform, and the same assets in two locations may have very different life expectancies, partly because of the ambient, but also because of the way they're treated. Imagine going to a large parking lot and someone says, you can take home any car you like, just pick the one you want. You're going to have a very good idea of which ones are reliable, which ones are less reliable. you're going to have a very good idea about the value of the individual units for what you want to call for. What other information would you be interested in? Sharing that type of a question means that people start to look at what data they have. So I want to know who's driven it for the last 10 years. I had what I used to call an F3, a fine Ford Focus. I kept it for 10 years. I gave it to someone else. 6 months later, they need a new one. There's nothing wrong after 10 years, and 6 months later, it's a wreck. So how people use things are very important to the asset lifecycle.
So I'm going back to the point that y'all discussed earlier about people just not being sufficiently motivated to solve a lot of these problems. And one of the things that I remember from looking into the history of asset management is that some of the, particularly in the UK, some of the things that got like the Institute for Asset Management created, and some of the early work on standards, past 55, for example, was a response to a disaster. And in this case, that North Sea oil rig, disaster that spilled all kinds. It's like their version of Deepwater Horizon. And I know in other countries, disasters have been a big impetus to taking action to get their acts together and to put in place, not only put in place standards, but also make investments to make sure these things don't happen again. We haven't had, we have no shortage of accidents and asset-related disasters in this country. Deepwater Horizon example, Exxon Valdez is another, that bridge over the Mississippi in Minneapolis. I mean, we've got PG&E with the San Bruno, fires from their gas system, which led them to go on and get certified to pass 55 and ISO 55001. But why don't we have more outrage at the disasters we have? Flint water, you mentioned. I mean, why didn't that lead to something really remarkable and powerful? I don't know the answer. It's one of the ways that the U.S. is remarkable in a bad way.
Well, we have specializations in disaster communications. I mean, we have very, very, very large, powerful, and expensive consulting firms that get called in to explain why that disaster wasn't really our fault, and how we're going to be better next time, and so forth. So I think the disasters can spur some things and maybe consolidate activities that are already underway. But I see that opportunity is a much more powerful motivator. When you look at what's going on in industry right now, the opportunities for integrating design, operations, and management, the efficiencies that are involved in that, the quality control that's available, the promise to the customer that's available, those things are all motivators that I think are more powerful long-term than papering over a disaster. One of the things I think is critical, I had a conversation recently with a company that's made some real serious strides in its service to its customers through analytics, which support the assets, which enable them to understand exactly what they're promising to the customers in terms of service. And my counsel, and I think for anyone listening, is you need the marketing group involved in that. Because as soon as that company got their salespeople involved in promising asset management results to customers, asset management became baked into the company. You can say what you want about top leadership. You can say what you want about finance, but get the sales and marketing people involved and to understand that asset management allows you to make promises that not only sound good, but those are promises you can keep. And they've become my favorite target when you put an asset management team together. I think if you don't have marketing involved, you're missing a major piece of the puzzle, and you're missing the continuity that's required for the organization.
I think
great idea.
I think after any kind of a disaster, there's a period of time where things can happen. where you can motivate people to get things done.
Yeah.
But the energy dissipates very quickly. And after that, then you've got to wait for the next one.
I'm fascinated by about the data. Do you think any of the political bodies, and I'm talking not partisan political, but like Congress or even local regulatory agencies, would have any appetite for actually requiring, from a transparency perspective, requiring organizations to post certain statistics, certain data about, whether it's water quality, whether it's, reliability of the electrical system, do you think that would be a path that might actually help improve things if we could require some of this transparency?
Well, for the electric supply industry, those statistics are already there in terms of what's called the system average interruption frequency and the system average number of customers interrupted. There are a whole range of KPIs which are produced. And of course, they're the things that get managed. How you get to a good KPI is pretty much irrelevant. And the question is, did you hit your target? Yes, then we don't fine you. I think for the company I work for, National Grid, 2009 was the first time in its several jurisdictions in the US that we didn't get fined in all of those jurisdictions, or in any of those jurisdictions, sorry. So that was a banner year, and you could say it was significantly affected by the ice storm of 2008. So.
Guys, this has been a great discussion. With the remaining 5 minutes, would you be willing to field a few questions? We have some.
As many as you like.
Cecilia has a question. She agrees that the common language is critical, but when you say inertia, does that also include lack of consciousness about the need to manage the assets actively and proactively? How and how much is the issue brought to the forefront of discussions in places where thought leaders, owners, and operators may be?
I think I was the one who introduced the word inertia, so I would say yes. If you're not aware of an issue, it's very difficult to address anything. And if you're choosing not to be aware, it makes it doubly difficult.
I would absolutely, and when we talk about, Tony and I, when we're talking about common language and data sharing, we're talking about a level of detail which goes far beyond the KPIs. In order for this stuff to be truly useful in management, it must be reliable and rigorous. I had a graduate student working for a major brewing company where the company spent 5 years and well over $5 million to develop a common taxonomy and common language for the equipment in its brewing lines. And that was the first step in controlling the assets. And they've taken a lot of other steps. But the issue is complex, it's demanding, and there has to be motivation to be willing to do this. It's not common language at the cocktail party level. It's common language at a business process level that is awfully difficult to develop, and there has to be more. There has to be motivation, and I think the motivation comes in from the customer, understanding what the customer wants and understanding how to serve that customer.
Awesome. There was another Marty Rowland had a comment worth addressing. Throughout the world, infrastructure is paid for by land value taxation. Witness transit in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Singapore, where no subsidy is needed for operations and capital. The same approach should be used for every type of asset and asset management system. You guys want to comment on that?
No, there's certainly plenty of comments about land value taxation being regressive in some cases and unfair. Well, there's a reason we went towards more user fees. And once we discovered user fees, then that dam broke and they're everywhere. If I look at my utility bill, half of what I pay for electricity is user fees of various sorts. Well over half of my water bill is user fees. It's not based on the usage. It's based on fees for, I don't know, we've thrown stormwater, we've thrown reforestation, we've thrown fire protection, we've thrown everything into the water utility because they have the ability to collect revenue. So you know, you can throw it into land value, but I think you have to be pretty careful about that. I mean, it may be in some cases that you want to put it into the general tax base instead.
Yep, sure. I would go refer to a comment from Marty Rowland, I believe it is, who said if Beverly Hills water came out brown, something would have been done. Whereas in Flint, it didn't happen anywhere near so quickly. The thing I would come back to in the discussion we've had so far, we've used the word asset, we've used the word asset management. And what we have is those words being used to reflect what I would call commodity items. People are seemingly understanding the word asset. People know what power transformers are. We know what water pipes are. We know various things. And I would recommend everyone become aware of a thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where just because we understand a little bit of the language doesn't mean we understand the thing itself. Just because we've seen entries in a spreadsheet doesn't mean we understand what those things are doing and capable of. And what we need is to have a little bit more understanding, and we need people who know what's actually going on with the assets themselves. We need to do that.
Great. Well, we are fast running out of time, and I want to be respectful of people's time. And so Jenny and Jim, if you guys would like to come on and do a brief closing, that would be great. Thank you, Tom and Tony and Jack.
This has challenged me in so many ways. And I really think Tony wrapped it up well with pointing us to that idea that just because we understand some terms, we have a lot of work to do to understand the big picture and the big issues. And I think we have a great start to that. This discussion around asset leadership, around the potential for asset management to solve large problems in our nation. So we've started working towards understanding more than just some terms, and I'm excited to see what comes from future sessions.
Yeah, it was great. I loved all the speakers, all the comments. It was quite a good start, I believe. Every year we're surprised of where we go with our fall event, and we end up in a remarkably new and different and more interesting place. I think one of the trends that I am hoping to see in the coming year, somebody mentioned CISA is a great thing. We need to have a relationship with CISA. I think there's some relationships we could make with other organizations about equity, where we can bring our broad and general expertise around asset management and asset leadership in ways that can inform efforts in a lot of these specific areas and help us all achieve our goals. So yeah, and expertise, I love that word. So we have a lot on the program, and we have a lot in attendance. So and we all continue to grow and learn, and hopefully we're contributing.
Awesome. Well, with that, I will show our sponsor slides just to make sure that we thank our organizational members, because again, without these organizations, we couldn't be doing what we're doing here.